Nightcast. Stephen Lloyd Gilbreth brings you the current news from the world today and how it relates to Bible prophecy. Understanding the end-time events leading to the peaceful world tomorrow. Ladies and gentlemen, Stephen Lloyd Gilbreth.
Good evening, friends, and welcome to this March 19, 2015 edition of Nightcast tonight. We have two pieces of good news. We got our video player back to working, and my back's a lot better, thanks to those of you who prayed. I'll tell you more details about both of those toward the end of the program. Opening story tonight, friends, is a rather sad one. At a Tunisia museum, bullets were sprayed, as some of the witnesses, the survivors, said, to intimidate us. 9 people have been arrested in connection with a gun attack in Tunis that saw 23 people killed on Wednesday, yesterday, including 20 foreign tourists. Tunisia's presidency said 4 of those arrested were directly linked to the attack and 5 had ties to the cell. The army will be deployed to major cities, the presidency added. James Reynolds has this opening report.
Tunisia's Black Wednesday has left its mark. The so-called Islamic State now says that its gunmen carried out the attack on the Bardo Museum. The gunmen took this road into the museum, and then when they got to this point, we understand that they started shooting and they headed down towards the museum itself. At this point, tourists would have heard the shots and the explosions, and they would have had just seconds to see if they could find a hiding place here in the main hall. Tourists from Japan, Spain, Australia, the UK and Italy were hit.
They came in and sprayed bullets around to intimidate us. My foot is injured and a bullet grazed my thigh. Next to me, there were 2 people who didn't move and others who were injured. Everyone was injured.
57-year-old Sally Adey, a solicitor from Shropshire, was killed in the attack. Her family say they're devastated by her loss. She and her husband Robert had been on a cruise on the MSC Splendida. This morning, their ship left Tunis for Barcelona. Robert Adey has stayed here. He's being helped by the British Embassy.
Well, these terrorist attacks yesterday in Tunisia were an appalling and brutal outrage. I can confirm that one of those killed was a British citizen, and our heart goes out to her family, and we'll do everything we can to help with the consular assistance and to help the family at this very difficult time.
Javier Camelo from Australia was also killed, as was his mother Miriam. Javier's father, Jose, was the only one of the 3 to survive. During the attack, Tunisian MPs found themselves trapped inside the parliament building right next to the museum. They sang the Tunisian national anthem in defiance, and they got out alive. This afternoon, outside the museum, demonstrators cheered for Tunisia. But this country faces difficult questions. It turns out that the authorities knew of one of the gunmen. Could they have done more to stop him and his accomplice?
Friends, our next story relates to a couple of things occurring in Europe that affect the EU. The caption on this first photograph for this next story reads, Mr. Tsipras, second from the left in this picture, is now holding crucial mini-summit talks with key EU players. The Greek Prime Minister has called for bold initiatives to reinvigorate his country's economy as EU leaders gather for a summit in Brussels. Alexis Tsipras is meeting with the leaders of Germany, France, and the EU institutions. EU leaders also agreed to link lifting sanctions against Russia over its role in the Ukraine crisis to the full implementation of a ceasefire deal. The move effectively extends the sanctions until the end of 2015. This is because last month's ceasefire deal in Minsk, Belarus, envisages Ukraine regaining full control over its eastern border with Russia, part of which are being held by separatist rebels by the end of the year. End quote. Our common intention is very clear: to maintain the sanctions until Minsk is fully implemented. Another quote. European Council, and that was a quote by the European Council President Donald Tusk speaking at a news conference. Ukraine Prime Minister Arseniy Yatsenyuk had earlier urged the EU to stand firm on sanctions against Moscow. He told the BBC that Russia should pay the price for its actions and suggested that any attempt to lift EU sanctions for financial reasons would be disgusting and unacceptable. And the caption with this next photograph, part of this story, actually, I believe this is actually going to be this opening frame for a video. The Ukrainian Prime Minister urged the EU to help seal Europe's borders against Russian infiltration.
I am not very optimistic over the chances in a forthcoming future to restore the border over Ukraine and Russian, to restore control over Ukraine and Russian border.
And without control of the border, you don't control the whole country, clearly, in the long term.
And this is the truth. And that's the reason why we ask our European partners, and we commend the efforts of Chancellor Merkel and President Hollande in Minsk to push Russia to the right decision. So we ask them to support us in sealing the border. Otherwise, look, this is an unlimited access for the Russian military, for Russian tanks, for Russian soldiers, just easily to cross Ukraine and Russian border, and then to increase their military capabilities and their military durability of Russian forces that are deployed in the east of Ukraine. So chances to de-escalate the situation in this case are extremely low.
British military trainers are now on the ground in Ukraine, 35 of them, training Ukrainian forces in what we're told is battlefield first aid, defensive military tactics. Is it enough? How much more do you need?
I want to be very clear that we are not just defending Ukraine. We defend the EU. We defend peace and stability in the entire Europe. We truly appreciate the UK support in sending trainers for the Ukrainian military, which is aimed at increasing durability of Ukrainian military. So again, we are fighting with the Russian regular forces. So we are defending ourselves. So please help us to defend our country and to defend your peace.
But do you think that plea will be answered? Do you think this initial British deployment is going to be the first of many and there will be other trainers, whether from Britain or other countries?
Well, this is the first step, and we expect to see another steps of another EU member states and our American friends.
Friends, now, in World War II, during World War II, there were two theaters, as they're often called, two stages of the war. One stage, one theater in Europe, and we've just been hearing news related from Europe related to the EU. The other stage or theater was in the Pacific, and there were battles with Japan and some involvement with China, and that's part of the Pacific theater or stage. And as we await and pray, hopefully be praying about the during this recess between, as Mr. Herbert W. Armstrong well phrased it, we're in a recess between round 2 and round 3 of World War, as if this were a boxing match, and there's different rounds. And I think that's a good way to analyze it, because the Bible clearly shows another round of World War coming once the seventh and final head of the Holy Roman Empire, which the Bible calls a beast, comes out of the abyss, comes out of the pit, comes out of a state of dormancy, of Rip Van Winkle sleep, you might say. He awakes, but the awakening is a brand new, not the same old Rip Van Winkle sleep, and yet it's the same angel gone bad behind it all, the God of this world who is influencing it all, who will help the woman, which the Bible uses as a symbol for a church. And let's just call a spade a spade. No reason to hide it, friends. Those of you watching who understand know this, and those of you who don't, you'll see it come about. Just look at history. The Holy Roman Empire has had associated with it the Roman Catholic Church, the Vatican, and its head leader, the Pope, who holds or presides over the coronation ceremonies for the emperor, the dictator, the beast, the head of each era of the Holy Roman Empire. I think we could call them eras. There's 7 eras of the Holy Roman Empire. 6 have come and gone. Revelation 17 verse 10 refers to them as kings. There are 7 kings, 7 eras of kings. 6 of the 5 are, it says, the verse 10 of Revelation 17 says 5 are fallen and 1 is. But that 1 was only for the time period between 1936 and 1945, when Mr. Herbert W. Armstrong, as God's servant, was broadcasting coast to coast in the United States and elsewhere in North America over some very powerful radio stations, a 100,000-watt station out of Mexico, blanketing the entire United States and up into Canada. And he announced who that 6th head of the Holy Roman Empire was when, in 1936, as the whole thing was unwinding before people's eyes, but God only revealed it through Mr. Armstrong. There's a reason, friends, why I'm emphasizing that, because as God says in the first chapter of Revelation, the opening of the seals of the book of Revelation is done by Jesus Christ through his servants. And as God says in Revelation 1, to show his servants and to show who his servants are and who he's leading in the who he's using in the human sphere as his servant, his leader for this last era. And that was, and in a certain way you could say, was and is Mr. Herbert W. Armstrong. I say and is because even though he's in the grave at the moment, it's kind of like the gospel writers, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. They died, they're in the grave, and yet their words live on. And it's in the chapters, the writings of Matthew and Luke, chapter 4, verse 4, in both cases, Matthew 4:4 and Luke 4:4, that God tells us we're to live by every word of God, not by bread alone, but by every word of God. That includes the words God spoke and had written, through those early apostles who have died. And it also, of course, includes the prophets who have died. And Jesus Christ, his words, which have been recorded by those writers, who also died, but he's the only one of those who've died who has been resurrected. But the point I was making is that many gospel writers, many prophets have died. God's end-time apostle has died, and yet his words, which are revelations that God made through Jesus Christ, through the human leader, Herbert Armstrong, those words live on, and we all who have been called to understand those things do well and are wise to heed those truths and things that God gave us through Mr. Armstrong. I really don't think I can emphasize that too much. And, you know, some recently have gotten offended by some things that I've said, and, you know, listen, before I do this broadcast every day and every time, and even during the broadcast sometimes, especially on a day like today when I had a lot on my plate, I ask God, when I open this mouth, for him to fill it. And friends, he does. And if you believe God, you know, there's a movie called Liar, Liar, where the little boy in the movie, the son of one of the lawyers, was able, it was like a prayer to God. He was able to have a wish granted. And his prayer, his wish was that one day in court, or the whole day, a certain day, his father, which included his father being a lawyer, included that his father being in a court trial situation that day. His wish that God granted in prayer in the movie granted was that his father would not be able to lie the whole day, would not be able to tell one lie. So the funniest scenes are when the lawyer is in court trial before the judge's bar, before the judge's bench, and where he's normally supposed to, you know, cover up for his client and this and that, and like attorneys and lawyers do, gleefully sometimes. The fellow was surprised himself, and so were all the people in his office as they heard him standing up there openly telling the truth about some things that he thought he should do muffled and keeping his mouth closed over. He himself found himself amazed at the look of surprise on his face after he would speak would be like, well, why did I say that? Why? Which was the truth, of course, but he couldn't lie. So you could pray that, same as I pray, God, when Stephen opens this mouth here on that live stream program he does every night, Sunday through Thursday night, and on the weekend, you speak through him, in spite of him. And then, you know, maybe we'll all be surprised, just like that movie Liar, Liar. You know, you can back me up with that kind of prayer. And if you think I'm saying something wrong, ask God to, hey, straighten him out. And when he opens his mouth, you speak through it. Don't let him say this or that if you think I'm saying something wrong. But I think most of those people who have said that, you know, they wind up blocking you on social media after they get mad at you. They don't want to hear your response, and they're oftentimes they're gone. And too bad for them. You know, but that's your prerogative. I often say, you know, if you don't like what you hear on this program, but you want news, there are plenty of other places you can get just the news. You can get it with all the liberal bent you want to it, etc. And we have been blessed, I feel, to be able to have access and license from the BBC to be able to carry their daily news clips, and we choose the ones related to the Bible and prophecy after a lot of careful looking and reviewing, and I do get a momentum on it. So today I was able to spend, you know, a lot of days I have to spend a lot of time looking through news stories. Today I was able to spend a lot of time working with a plumber who was here on an emergency basis so that we could have certain things that the water company is looking for in an inspection they had scheduled for today. And so we had to have certain things ready for this inspection, which wound up being put off, and it's a good thing in a way because we got things we got to do to be able to pass that inspection. But we made a lot of headway, and we'll probably finish up Sunday. The next time they'll be able to inspect will be Monday, and so we might have everything ready for that. In the meantime, the water is off here, but my neighbor's been pretty nice. You know, I got a horse, a donkey, a goat. I'll just tell you these few private things. We got a couple stories, a very important story out of Israel to finish up with tonight, friends. But I told you I'd tell you a couple good things. One is we got the video player working. The last couple days, as I told you last night, and last night too, we missed 2 nights because the video downloader player wasn't working, and strangely, it wouldn't cooperate on the network system. I didn't do a thing to it today. I turned it on and said, well, God, if I'm going to be on, the thing's got to work. And lo and behold, strangely, it was just working. Nobody did anything different to it. It just worked. So, but it also has told me during the past couple of days, Steve, get a backup system. Get a backup that's totally off this system that works, so that when this happens again, just turn on the other one. And, you know, they do that on airplanes for good reason. They have backups. When something goes wrong, oftentimes they have backups. They should. Anyway, so those are the two things. The video player's working, and as I mentioned, I was able to work with the plumber. I put on a back brace, and he and I shoved 50 feet of K-quality 1-inch copper soft tubing, all one piece, through 4-inch PVC pipe, and that he pulled from a basement. I pushed from outside, and I was able to, and it was tough pushing that. I was able to do it, though, and my back is a little sore tonight, but I got a feeling I'm going to sleep like a baby tonight. All right, now those are the personal things, and part of the good news I wanted to share with you. And let's get to these last couple of stories. China and Japan. Now, I was mentioning the two theaters of World War, the European theater and the Pacific theater. And am I saying that right? The European theater, I think so. And in the Pacific theater, there's been a row between China and Japan. And in the last few years, there's really been a row that has aroused my attention since 2012. You're going to see that in this next report. China and Japan, and by the way, I got to be sure and turn off the audio as we play it, because it has music that we don't have the license to be able to play, but we can. You'll see the subtitles on the screen, and I'll try to read those to you as they go by. China and Japan are holding their first high-level security talks in 4 years, following recent tensions over territorial and historical issues that we've been showing you since 2012, those territorial issues. And sometimes they've really been boom, boom. The meeting in Tokyo among officials comes ahead of trilateral talks with South Korea this coming Sabbath. The last rounds of talks were in 2011. In this special video, friends, the BBC News explains why relations worsened, and they do it in a special little summary outline thing in less than a minute of a video produced by, with thanks and a salute to Sarah Barman. And I'm going to try to read these to you as we go. Does this bizarre handshake suggest a thaw between China and Japan? I know some of you listen only on a podcast, so we read them for two reasons. One is sometimes they put them up so fast, and the other, if you're listening on a podcast, you're not going to know what the subtitle is unless somebody reads it to you. Here's the second one. In November, the country's leaders had a frosty meeting in the APEC summit. And as you can see, the looks on their faces, it indeed was frosty. Tension goes back decades. China accuses Japan of whitewashing World War II atrocities. And then the more recent thing, but it grew in 2012 in a territorial dispute over these tiny, uninhabited islands. They don't look much, those islands don't look much, but are near important shipping lanes and potential oil reserves. They're near. There were fears a clash between military patrols could trigger a conflict. China was also upset when previously pacifist Japan changed its defense policy in 2014, a change that also affected the United States. Now China and Japan are holding their first high-level security talks for 4 years. And that's the end of that. Friends, again, that special video produced by Sarah Barman. Sarah, thank you very much for that. Now we'll get our audio back up for our next story. Actually, most of this is going to be with photographs. The caption on this opening photograph with this next story related to Israel, friends, reads, let me back that up. With this first photograph, reads, Mr. Netanyahu's Likud party will be the first to meet Israel's president for talks on forming a new government. And here is one that's probably going to be a shocker for some people in a way. Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has watered down a pre-election vow not to allow the establishment of a Palestinian state. In a U.S. television interview, Mr. Netanyahu said he wanted a two-state solution, but said, quote, circumstances have to change. The interview with MSNBC was his first since winning a clear election victory earlier this week. As the campaign ended, Mr. Netanyahu had appealed to supporters by saying he would not allow a Palestinian state. But that view was tempered in today's interview, in which he also denied accusations that another last-minute campaign pronouncement amounted to racism. Quote, I don't want a one-state solution. I want a sustainable two-state, a sustainable, peaceful two-state solution. But for that, circumstances have to change, Mr. Netanyahu told MSNBC. And a further quote by Mr. Netanyahu, I never changed my speech in Bar Ilan University 6 years ago, calling for a demilitarized Palestinian state that recognizes the Jewish state. What has changed is the reality, he said. Mr. Netanyahu's campaign comments and a speech he made to the U.S. Congress earlier this month were widely seen to have soured relations between Israel and the Obama administration. Well, at least they brought that fact more obvious to the fore, which seems to be a fact that really already existed. On Thursday, the White House said President Barack Obama had called Mr. Netanyahu to congratulate him on his victory. Islamist forces is the head note on this next section. Friends, it reads, in his interview, Mr. Netanyahu cited as a sticking point Palestinian leader Mahmoud Abbas' refusal to recognize Israel as a Jewish state. And then, friends, there's more in this news story, but I want to break and read to you an analysis by Kim Gattis of the BBC News in their New York office. He says President Obama did not rush to congratulate Mr. Netanyahu, and when he called him, it was mainly to make clear where the U.S. stood on a two-state solution and on nuclear negotiations with Iran, just in case Mr. Netanyahu had forgotten during his urgent rush to win more votes, this analysis says. it goes further and says Mr. Netanyahu himself has flip-flopped on his comments about a Palestinian state and his call to drown out Arab voters. But the damage is done. Campaign rhetoric can be dismissed, but this is also a clarifying moment for all those who still hoped for a peace process. Quote, no matter what Mr. Netanyahu says now about peace, the Palestinians can claim he simply doesn't mean it. On Iran, Mr. Netanyahu's return is Mr. Obama's loss, and it will make Republicans in Congress even more adamant to fight a deal. Now, that's the end of the analysis by the BBC correspondent in New York. Back to our news story on this. He also repeated, Mr. Netanyahu, in his interview today, also repeated a frequent criticism of Mr. Abbas' decision, of Mr. Abbas' decision to form a unity government with militant Islamist group Hamas, which is sworn to Israel's destruction. And he criticized the idea that Israel might hand over territory to the Palestinians at the current time. Quote, every territory that is vacated in the Middle East is taken up by Islamist forces, Mr. Netanyahu said. And then the caption on this next photograph with this story, friends, reads, Netanyahu beat off a challenge from the center left to win a resounding election victory. And then there's just a little more in this story that we'll end with tonight, friends. Despite Mr. Netanyahu's comments, the White House warned there would be, quote, consequences for Israel as the U.S., quote, re-evaluates the diplomatic strategy. He, Mr. Netanyahu, walked back from commitments that Israel had previously made to a two-state solution, said White House spokesman Josh Earnest. It is cause for the United States to evaluate what our path is forward. Mr. Netanyahu's original comments were made on Monday, one day before Israel's election, when he was asked by an interviewer, if you are prime minister, a Palestinian state will not be established. That was the question. Mr. Netanyahu answered, indeed. Analysts viewed the remark as an attempt to shore up support among right-wing voters, as polls showed his Likud party just behind the center-left opposition alliance, the Zionist Union. The Zionist Union had promised to repair ties with the Palestinians and the international community. Mr. Netanyahu's remark prompted the U.S., the EU, and the UN to urge a continuation of efforts to secure a two-state solution in the Middle East. Mr. Netanyahu also used his MSNBC interview today to insist that a separate comment made on Election Day itself was not racist. On Tuesday, Mr. Netanyahu posted a video message on his Facebook page in which he said, right-wing rule is in danger. Arab voters are going to the polls in droves. Left-wing organizations are bringing them in buses. That video was criticized as, quote, dog whistle racism, an accusation he denied in his interview. An Arab vote is, I think, it's very, very important. I'm very proud to be the prime minister of all of Israel's citizens, Arabs and Jews alike, he said. The White House called the video a, quote, cynical Election Day tactic, end quote, and, quote, a pretty transparent effort to marginalize Arab Israeli citizens. I can tell you that these are views the administration intends to communicate directly to the Israelis, Mr. Ernest said on Thursday, today. Meanwhile, the office of Israel's President Reuven Rivlin confirmed that Mr. Netanyahu's Likud party would be the first to meet him for talks on forming a new government. Meetings with representatives of 10 political parties will take place over Sunday and Monday. And friends, that is it for tonight's edition of Nightcast, and that's it for this week. We're off Friday night and Saturday night. I'm on another channel with something else on the weekend for those that tune in there. Otherwise, God willing, and the creek don't rise, we'll plan to be back Sunday evening with the current news from tomorrow, Friday, and Sabbath and Sunday, right here on Nightcast. Until next time, this is your host, Stephen Lloyd Gilbreth, your host for Nightcast, saying thanks for joining me tonight, friends. So long and good night.
You have been watching Nightcast with Stephen Lloyd Gilbreth. Nightcast can be seen Sunday through Thursday nights here on cogtv.org. Tonight's program is also available anytime on demand in the cogtv.org video archive.